Next on Falcon Crest. Learn how fear has changed America's moral conscience.
Casual sex is basically over.
Then will those designing women succumb to sexual harassment?
There is a growing network of psychiatrists and psychologists who believe their patients, particularly the female patients, were abused in satanic rituals.
Multiple personalities. Have you ever seen someone change personalities right in front of your eyes?
Patients who have been programmed to kill at a certain time.
But is it not a fact that a 3.5-year-old girl identified you as the alleged perpetrator of molestation?
This was after she had been subjected to therapy.
And attempts to communicate with
You let the kids out of the house. Don't ever do that again, you hear?
By the 1980s, psychotherapy had become one of the fastest growing industries in the United States. Its success in the real world mirrored its growing depiction in the mass media, where psychiatrists had come to replace priests as authority figures who could still inner turmoil and help us confront our inner demons. In 1980, the same year that misery memoir Michelle Remembers became a bestseller, popularising the archetype of the heroic therapist, the new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-III, was also released. This weighty new edition was a response both to the ongoing growth of the practice and the increased use of pharmaceuticals as a standard treatment. Reflecting psychiatry's growing influence, it was far less technical than previous editions, and readily understandable by those without substantial medical training. Cornelia Wilbur had already planted multiple personality disorder deep into the public consciousness with her blockbuster book Sybil and its hit spin-off TV series starring Sally Field. And thanks to her influence and activism, it was now elevated to an official diagnosis.
And in case you don't believe what you're seeing, the American Psychiatric Association officially recognizes what it calls multiple personality disorder, and it defines it this way: the existence within the individual of two or more distinct personalities, each of which is dominant at a particular time.
Transitioning between personalities was associated with stress which had its origins in childhood abuse, which was often of a sexual nature. As per Wilbur's archetypical case, these episodes resulted in lost memories that the heroic psychiatrist was tasked to retrieve.
When one personality does something, the others aren't around to remember it.
Before publication of the DSM-III in 1980, there were only 200 cases of multiple personalities discovered worldwide. By 1986, it had risen to 4,000, and by the mid-90s, there were 40,000 cases in North America alone. Mirroring depictions in popular culture, the vast majority of these cases, over 90%, were women. They were often discovered to have two divergent personalities: the reserved matron and the promiscuous libertine, the ancient trope of the Madonna and the whore. Psychiatrists started their own journals about multiple personality disorder, or MPD, and began citing their own work to each other in a feedback loop that strengthened their beliefs that they had uncovered a hidden epidemic. Within this epistemically closed circuit, therapists validated increasingly extraordinary reports of patients with not just two, but dozens or hundreds of personalities.
Doctors say there are 5 personalities living inside James. Under hypnosis, James switches to another personality, Shay, the homosexual. And then there is Jimmy, who is much younger.
7.
I'm 32 years old, married for 13 years, and have 3 children.
She also has, says her doctor, 100 separate personalities.
My name is Death.
Who am I talking to?
Missy.
Missy?
Missy.
And how old are you?
19.
Is it fun talking like a little girl, Miss Dorset?
Multiple personality disorder was heavily reliant on the existence of repressed memories, ones not normally available to the conscious mind. So to therapists, these cases represented a thrilling quest into the unconscious, where they got to play a psychiatric Nemo on a quest to uncover forgotten vistas of personal trauma. Luckily for them, there was a glut of supplementary textbooks about trauma that would classify virtually any reason to visit a psychotherapist into a potential clue of MPD. The first, Rennie Fredrickson's Repressed Memories, writes that repressed memories are pieces of your past that become like a mystery. They stalk your unconscious and hamper your life with their aftermath. Laura Davies' Allies in Healing continued this theme, writing that memories of sexual abuse were stored away in parts of themselves that aren't available to the conscious mind. Then, 10 or 20 years later, these repressed childhood memories surface, often creating havoc in their lives. However, by far the most influential of these books was The Courage to Heal by Laura Davies and a woman called Ellen Bass, who she met at a creative writing class. Neither of them had a background in psychotherapy and were dismissive of any evidence to underlie their theories. Bass admitted in an interview that if we waited for scientific knowledge to catch up, we could just forget the whole thing. My ideas are not based on any scientific theories. These books, taken together, contained a catalogue of warning signs that were supposed indicators of repressed memories. Many of these were contradictory, reminiscent of Barnum statements used by psychics and fortune tellers to apply to virtually anyone. Barnum statements can be something like, "You have a tendency to be critical of yourself," or "You have a great need for others to like and admire you." And so similarly, these warning signs were so broad that they could apply to anyone who had ever experienced or felt any human emotion. They included things like taking risks and the inability to take risks, phobias and headaches, being compulsively seductive or compulsively asexual, feeling crazy, wearing too many clothes, alcohol abuse, not drinking alcohol, mood swings and eating disorders, hopelessness and alienation, nightmares and a sense of doom. The expansive nature of these signs meant that patients would come in for therapy to treat something like depression or anxiety, only to have their therapist suggest very quickly that the root cause of their misery must be sexual abuse at the hands of close family members. Some therapists boasted of being able to diagnose this trauma within minutes of meeting patients.
Very few patients who have been ritually abused come in and say, "I've been ritually abused, and I've been through this torture and that torture, and I've been pregnant this many times and aborted this many times and forced to participate in cannibalism," and on and on and on. On the contrary, these people do everything they can to deny the existence of that.
What really brought all this out was two things. First of all, I was having headache problems, daily headaches for years that started when I first got married.
Vanessa originally sought psychiatric help for depression and eating disorders.
Even if the patient was skeptical, subsequent sessions would revolve around scouring the patient's memories, thoughts and dreams for anything that might fit this hypothesis. After the idea of abuse was first planted and cultivated, it became a battle of will between the therapist and the patient, but it was a rigged game, as anything the patient subsequently did or said was taken as evidence that the therapist was correct. If a patient reacted angrily to the idea that they'd been abused, it was taken as denial and thus evidence of abuse. If the patient had no memory of abuse, it meant that the memories were so terrifying that they must have been repressed. Having episodes of childhood memories that were missing, normal childhood amnesia, was interpreted as evidence that the abuse happened during that particular period. Hypnotised and in a vulnerable and suggestible state, patients tended to conform to what's known in psychology as the demand characteristic, when subjects subconsciously change their behaviour to align with the expectations of those conducting the experiment. They tell them what they want to hear. This was made worse by the fact that on top of being under hypnosis, patients were often prescribed a cocktail of powerful drugs which deepened the psychic delirium. The social power imbalance in favour of the therapist granted them enormous creative direction to shape and reconstruct the images flickering in the patient's mind, which would later be mistaken for real memories.
I count 12 people who answer the door. There may be more, maybe 13. 13 were Mary Coven.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, there was another name coming.
What was that?
Regina.
Regina.
Uh-huh.
And that would make 13?
Uh-huh.
By my count. That's a coven, right?
Uh-huh.
No, there's this other voice in there that just keeps saying they wish I'd shut up and stop making all this stuff up.
Hello, Satan. Hello, Satan.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good.
Consumed by the belief that they were uncovering real memories, the therapists were in fact imposing their own belief systems and worldview onto the vulnerable psyche of the patient. And so it was that many of the stories recovered during these sessions were patchworks of satanic folklore and references to movies, newspaper stories, and books like Michelle Remembers, and later Satan's Underground. Gruesome accounts of sadistic devil worshippers who had abused them as children to create these fractured personalities. In this suggestible state, patients were then asked to visualise sexual abuse at the hands of their own family members within this theatrical context. Some therapists told patients to visualise their memories as videotapes and play them back in their minds, each time with increasing levels of detail. They were then asked to consider what they saw in their minds as what had really happened to them, confusing imagination and memory, altering their understanding of their own past and sense of self, and further fueling their descent into unreality. Real memories were often distorted or lost entirely, replaced instead by episodes of unimaginable horror.
We're talking about people in some cases who are coming to us as patients who were raised in satanic cults from the time they were born.
As her therapy continued, she began to remember episodes of sexual abuse at the hands of her father. Those memories then turned into vivid recollections of satanic rituals.
Who's there?
Sarah.
How old are you, Sarah?
I'm 5.
Who's this?
Karen.
Karen, you don't seem too happy.
I'm not.
Most of these people come to us thinking what's happened to them isn't true.
Christy finally escaped from her family and underwent years of therapy.
When they're in a memory, they know it's true.
It wasn't until about 4 years ago that I what we call breakthrough. I began to have these memories.
I've blocked out a lot of the memories I had because of my multiple personality disorder.
They don't want it to be true, so they go back and forth. We call it the true, not true experience.
And what's your mother doing?
She's
in all of this. What's her role in all of this?
I'm not exactly what her role is. I haven't, recovered all of my memories.
It's so hard to think that you've been through all this and you're only now remembering it.
I can understand why it's hard to believe. It's the sort of thing that nobody wants to believe.
Drain their blood, make them drink blood, kill animals. I mean, the list is endless on what they do to them. And I haven't even got to 7 years old yet.
I had to have oral sex with a bunch of dogs.
Christy says her parents forced her to participate in gruesome rituals, drinking blood, eating feces, and killing children.
Right. When I was very young, I was forced to participate in that, in which I had to sacrifice an infant.
They stabbed the baby and killed it, and we all had to drink blood.
I know that there were at least 12 dogs in there, and there might have been more. I mean, I never really stopped to count. I just remember that there were a lot of them.
And there'd be people chanting and the black robes. And I remember one of the first experiences as a teenager where I watched them sacrifice a little boy, blonde hair, blue eyes, just this beautiful little boy, and he was about 5 years old.
This is my truth as I know it, and I know that I didn't make it up.
In many accounts which appeared in the media, there are claims of abuse that seem to have been adapted wholesale from the book Michelle Remembers, such as the story of her being kept in a wire cage in a closet above a pit of snakes.
An apparent switch from Kim to the child personality, Jill, was triggered by the memory of being locked in a closet for many hours by abusive parents.
It was a very small closet, and it was also, there were a lot of things in it. It was very stuffed full of things, and there were
What's the trouble?
I
we? Hmm? Where are we?
What's your name?
Jill, where are we?
Put them in with cages with snakes and crap like that, lower them into graves.
It was actually a closet and a welded wire cage, and the bottom of the cage would be open. That would be how I would be put in it and suspended in a closet. And it was a very simple thing that they did. They just set a board inside the door and then dumped a bunch of snakes in on the floor, which I could see. They were probably even harmless snakes, but I was a child, and then they shut the door and left me in there in the dark, and I could hear it.
One contemporary author compared the therapy sessions to the interrogation tactics used during the War on Terror.
Survivors need to know that there's hope.
Mary has people that care about her, take care of her. You don't have one person that cares about you. Everybody around you's in the cult. You don't know what it is to be a person.
Remember the memory. Remember the memory of what they did with her. Now that you've gotten back some of these memories, tell her what you'd really like to say to her.
I hate you. I hate you. How could you do those things to me?
After having sunk thousands, sometimes millions of dollars into therapy, most patients relented to the new reality, and they began to officially identify family members as abusers and members of the cult. In some cases, entire genealogies were mapped out, with each family member lumped into one of three categories: offenders, victims, and deniers. Patients were then encouraged to write letters to their families, making them aware of the accusations. The inevitable damage this caused eventually created massive stress and conflict between patient and the family. She, and it was almost always she, was then encouraged to break ties with what her therapist called the family of origin, and join instead a surrogate family, a support group of other patients, in which doubting one's own memories of satanic abuse, or those of others, no matter how fantastic, was strictly prohibited. A poisonous environment where suffering and emotional turmoil were glorified, and where the market forces propelling the industry ensured the pain would never be healed.
Nathan, he used a knife and made us stick it in a person.
While adult women made up the large bulk of those who suffered directly after being diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, the broken marriages and traumatised children were also collateral damage, especially as the idea of intergenerational satanic cults gripped the psychiatric community. When families began to implode due to the actions of the psychiatrists, their children were drawn into the orbit of the child protection workers, who credulously viewed the allegations as just another form of child abuse. And in putting their credibility behind it all, psychiatrists added intellectual weight to the phenomena. Children found themselves caught in a matrix in which parents, police officers, fundamentalist churches, juvenile delinquency experts, and child protection workers worked together to battle the phantom threat and impose their horrific fantasies onto them. As with the adult psychiatrists, they perceived anything the child said or did as evidence of their thesis. Children were isolated from their families and pressured into giving the answers the interviewers wanted. They were given lists of satanic symbols and asked to point at which ones were present at the cult ritual. They were also encouraged to describe scenes of extreme violence and sexual activity. When children became anxious at being repeatedly asked questions, it was taken as evidence of repressed memories. The children were reluctant, but adults rewarded them with hugs, praise, and stickers. The children soon learned how to end the ordeal by giving the interviewers the answers they wanted. Cassettes and videotapes filled with testimony were used against the accused, often including their own families.
She had stomach aches, she had headaches, she would complain about various limbs hurting her, screaming with pain, just absolutely screaming with pain. Finally, one day after being in school about 6 months, a little over 6 months, she had told my oldest daughter she was poked. And once that came out, I knew.
At first, Kenny assumed her daughter was the victim of sexual abuse, and she placed the little girl in therapy.
When you get to kids who are 4 and especially 5 on up, who are still having a lot of fears of ghosts and monsters and Draculas and that sort of thing, You want to be looking very closely at them. The child is really supposed to outgrow that. Children who've been ritually abused tend to think that there's a monster or a ghost living in their closet.
And what about this monster?
That's Nightshade.
That's who?
Nightshade.
Nightshade. What does Nightshade do when Nightshade comes out? Oh, he puts kids in the grinder. Now this monster is a new personality that we've never met before. We often find that children have had monsters who have been programmed by cults in order to get a child to get an altar that will help them perpetrate, that will become cult identified.
That's drawn by Lisa Steinberg with the satanic pentagram on it and with the descending crescent moon above it.
That's the baby right there.
Right here?
Uh-huh, it came out of her already.
What'd they do to the baby?
Then David took it and kept throwing it against the wall, and he killed it, and he took it in the house.
No, you saw that?
Yeah.
This is a typical kind of ritual which involves the kidnapping of children. You can see the cauldron, the boiling cauldron, preparation for the human stew. You can see the cult leader here.
She has at one point, and as she continues in therapy, gets better and better, but at one point believed very much so that she was a child of Satan and that she actually had Satan's heart put into her.
What would you say to the little children that were out there?
Pray and scream.
Yeah.
I know.
Who's your savior?
Jesus.
Anyone that they hold.
Just as legends of satanic cults melded with the growing phenomena of MPD, so too did the hysteria about threats posed by sects of devil worshippers fuse with growing social anxieties about daycare centres. To some evangelical Christians, the growth of outsourced childcare didn't reflect the new social and economic realities in which more women were in the workforce. Instead, the growth of daycare centres were perceived as part of the heinous plot to corrupt and abuse their children. The accusation that ignited this bonfire of psychosocial drama was first made in 1983, when a mother from Kern County, California, reported that her daughter had been sadistically abused by a staff member in the McMartin Daycare Centre in Manhattan Beach, Los Angeles. The police then wrote to 200 other parents asking them a set of leading questions, which in turn led to a set of interviews with social workers, not stopping until the children had volunteered answers that the therapists and social workers wanted. 7 arrests were made, and 5 individuals were accused of 321 accounts of sexual abuse.
The defendants faced more than 300 counts of sodomy, rape, and oral copulation.
It was rumoured that pornographic movies were being made at McMartin, feeding into the deep fears of anti-porn feminists like Andrea Dworkin.
The McMartin case, in point of fact, almost started an avalanche of these kinds of cases and of charges being brought.
By the end of 1984, a further 7 preschools had been shut down. Momentum grew, and new organisations with titles such as Affirming Children's Truth and We Believe the Children began to uncritically support the kids' testimonies.
But is it not a fact that a 3.5-year-old girl identified you as the alleged perpetrator of molestation?
This was after she had been subjected to therapy.
Parents have to be aware that children are not lying. Police officers have to listen to children.
The children of McMartin are still filled with lurid stories of their awful experience there. Now in the safe haven of a concerned foster family, the children are haunted by their personal nightmares.
My dad was involved in a lot of it. Okay, he's like one of the main guys. He's a leader or something. I don't know. I just don't like him.
Do you allege your husband was part of a satanic cult?
I allege that he was the high priest of a satanic cult.
David, the boy's father, has never been formally charged. He's now in hiding.
This sounds crazy, but when you begin to hear this same thing time and again, different stories, but the same horrible underlying things, the same behaviors in the kids, I just want to scream. If you see something or you hear something from somebody else, just remember what you heard from me.
So incredibly
believable.
Graham.
Introducing the Laser Demon.
A demon spirit of madness and murder.
Yes, we're American and we're giving our best.
A leading figure within the psychiatric community pushing MPD, indeed a pioneer of the field, was Dr. Bennett Braun. Braun chaired the annual conference of the International Society for the Study of Multiple Personality Disorder and Dissociation, and opened the first dissociative disorder unit in the country, a multi-million-dollar practice at Rush Presbyterian Medical Center. He was also the founding editor of the journal Dissociation and edited the 1986 book Treatment of Multiple Personality Disorder. The reason these cases are so hard to diagnose is that the patients develop so many personalities to hide behind as a means of protection, and unless these personalities can be coaxed out from the dark shadows of the patient's mind, you would never know they existed. Patients of Braun's Institute seemed to follow a particular pattern. Elizabeth Gale came to Braun for treatment for depression, but was later convinced that she'd been brainwashed into making babies for satanic cults, babies that were used in pornography before being sacrificed and eaten. Over an 11-year period, she spent more than 2,000 days in psychiatric hospitals, opting to have herself sterilised to stop breeding new victims. In fact, she had never been pregnant. Mary Shanley sought treatment for depression when she was 39 years old, but was gradually convinced that her mother was a high priestess of a satanic cult, and that she was being groomed to be her successor. Mary was convinced that she had 7 different cult altars due to the trauma. After she had refused to believe the stories, Braun was convinced that she was beyond treatment, and ordered she be cut off from her friends and family. Her son Ryan was taken into therapy, being told his mind had already been warped by her cult. Despite being a perfectly normal child, he too was diagnosed as a dangerous, structured, polyfragmented MPD. For the treatment of her and her family, her health insurance was charged over $2 million, and even after release, her family refused to talk to her, believing she was satanic royalty.
I really believed that I would either end up in a psych unit for the rest of my life, or that when my insurance ran out, that I would live underneath a bridge as a rag woman.
Pat Burgess was one of the first patients treated by Braun after seeking help for depression after a difficult birth. Braun convinced her that she once had sex with JFK, had eaten meatloaf made of human flesh, had 300 alter personalities, was descended from Slavic royalty, and ran a satanic cult that operated in 9 different states.
All reality and fantasy just blended together. I was drugged, I was hypnotized, and I was mentally ill.
She was also made to think she'd sexually abused her own children, who were then taken under the protection of the hospital, where they would spend the next 3 years. One of the gory claims that emerged from the sessions with her children was later recited by Braun as he testified as an expert witness at another repressed memory case in Santa Ana, California in 1991.
I had one child who was just 5 years old talk to me about what it's like to stick a knife in somebody's abdomen and pull it down, and how the intestines pop out. I mean, they just blow out. And what it smells like. In the description of that, having done surgery myself, I know what it's like to open in the belly. And if the anesthesia isn't done right and the muscle relaxant isn't done right, that's exactly what happens. The bowels come right out through the wound. And here's a 5-year-old that can describe to me something I know something about, and have it perfectly as far as I'm concerned. Where does a 5-year-old learn about this? Not many 5-year-olds go in operating rooms.
And I told Dr. Braun, I said, wait a minute, you know, hearing him, I know that's not real. Because I know that's a scene from a Star Wars movie.
Ben.
Where Luke Skywalker cuts open this beast he was riding, and all the guts spill out, and it smells really terrible.
I thought they smelled bad on the outside.
Bennett Braun's Rush Presbyterian Medical Center began screening the mail of those who were confined at the institute under the pretext of looking for encrypted messages from the cult. They demanded another woman prove the cult was no longer a threat to her before they would agree to discharge her from the hospital. With patients restrained on beds for sometimes 16 hours a day in attempts to draw out alternate personalities, and where children were separated from their parents for similar interrogations, staff at Braun's Institute became horrified at what they were part of. But the psychiatrists treated them as if they were simply not smart enough to see the bigger picture and threatened them with transfer or demotion if they criticised the methods.
There was also a lot of discussion about the nurses, that the reason there was such a conflict was because the nurses just couldn't, quote, understand what was going on. So the belief was if they just educated us more, we would understand everything.
Some were told to go and educate themselves, while others were accused of being cult members themselves. In their own words, it produced a chilling effect that inhibited criticism of what was happening around them. In its crusade to uncover this wretched shadow world of underground satanic death cults, one littered with the broken lives of depressed women, Dr. Braun found powerful allies in the feminist movement.
We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Dr. Braun.
Feminist activist Gloria Steinem and others saw in the satanic abuse stories a reflection of their own struggle to break the silence about sexual violence, and saw in the psychiatrist's cause parallels to early feminist consciousness-raising groups.
9 out of 10 people diagnosed as multiples are women. Women are more likely to be abused, especially sexually, as children.
Steinem even thanked Braun in her 1992 book Revolution from Within, and delivered a keynote speech at the National Conference on Multiple Personality Disorder. In 1993, Ms. Magazine, the publication founded by Steinem, also ran a cover story on the subject of cult ritual abuse. Anti-pornography campaigner Andrea Dworkin likewise saw parallels, as she believed in the causal relationship between porn and sexual violence. Her dystopian view of human sexuality was one in which sex was the means by which the male colonizes the female.
My name is Andrea Dworkin. I am a citizen of the United States. And in this country where I live, every year millions and millions of pictures are made of women with our legs spread. The women in the pornography, 65 to 70% of them, we believe, are victims of incest or child sexual abuse. We see the centrality of pornography in serial murders. There are snuff films where women are murdered for the sexual pleasure of murdering women. And there are those who say it is a form of freedom. And it creates a vast hopelessness for women, a vast despair. One lives inside a nightmare.
The worst filth, the worst rot, the worst hellish perversion.
This unusual alliance between psychiatrists, anti-porn feminists and Christian evangelicals added enormous credibility to rumours of a real criminal underworld comprised of satanic cults. All that was required to find evidence of it was fracking people's minds for testimony and destroying largely healthy nuclear families in the process.
What is all this like from the parents' point of view? We're going to talk with a mother who says she was close with her daughter until her daughter said that she abused her in a satanic cult.
She said that we pretended pretended to be the perfect family, and that she was removing herself from our family unit.
Though the Gradys were found innocent, they have not seen their daughter for more than 2 years now, but they believe her whereabouts are known by Michael Moore, who they are suing for slander.
And please forgive the phraseology here, but I feel it. They have emotionally and mentally raped our daughter.
I don't understand how it could happen either. And I miss her. I miss my daughter.
The psychiatric industry had created a grotesque bureaucratic machine to destroy families and inflict mental trauma on thousands of people across the United States. As more and more families were destroyed, psychiatrists and therapists began receiving death threats.
But somebody is apparently trying to discourage scrutiny. We've talked to therapists who treat ritual abuse victims, and they tell us of the threats they've received.
I have direct knowledge of both death threats on a therapist and an attempt to end that therapist's life, which was unsuccessful.
Here in Chicago, a group of well-known therapists from all over the country had the courage to share horror stories of threats and intimidation.
Therapists have been directly threatened in ways that are quite alarming to them. Someone out there is telling us to back off. The patient indicated to me that she wished to sacrifice the child with which she was pregnant. Naturally, I wasn't too enthusiastic about this. Shortly after this occurred, I started to get telephone death threats.
One of the things that I would add is that we are now hearing these reports from literally hundreds of therapists in every part of the United States.
Rather than reflect on the damage they had inflicted, and thoroughly convinced of their own righteousness, they developed a siege mentality, interpreting the death threats as further evidence of the diabolical conspiracy. Like many evangelical eccentrics before them, they were convinced Satanists were behind the animosity they encountered.
And we have not had much success in the last couple of years because they have stepped up the death threats within the occult for people leaving, like the Berlin Wall.
And these Satanists came to my house, 5 of them, and threatened my life.
I received threatening mail. My mail was opened. My little sister was harassed coming to and from school.
Death threats and the growing belief they were onto something deepened the groupthink amongst the therapist community. Those sceptical of the existence of satanic cults self-censored for the sake of group cohesion, fear of ostracism, or damage to their career prospects. It became an environment in which skeptical or questioning voices were suppressed, and so the psychiatric community became a primary vector for satanic mythology, spreading through conferences and journals where survivor stories were repeated uncritically and patients' emotional states were valued and emphasised over any sort of corroborating facts. How was it that these ideas found themselves entrenched within the mainstream psychiatric community? Part of the reason was that it was being spread by those at the very heart of the profession.
When you use the word they, who are you talking about?
Well, I wish we knew who they were.
In 1992, distinguished psychiatrist Professor Corey Hammond, president of the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis and author of the Handbook of Hypnotic Suggestions and Metaphors, gave a lecture at the 4th Annual Eastern Regional Meeting on Multiple Personality Disorders. In it, he outlined an elaborate theory of the ultimate origins of the condition.
At the end of World War II, before it even ended, they not only get out rocket scientists, but they also get out some Nazi doctors who have been doing mind control research in the death camps. And they started doing mind control research for military intelligence in military hospitals in the United States. And the people that came, the Nazi doctors, were Satanists. They brought them to the United States. Along with them was a young boy, a teenager, who had been raised in a Hasidic Jewish tradition and a background of Kabbalistic mysticism, but he saved his skin by collaborating and being an assistant to them in the death camp experiments. Obtained an MD degree, became a physician, and continued this work and appears to be at the center of the cult programming today. That was the background of Dr. Green.
Like a psychiatric Sherlock Holmes, Hammond had assembled his own Moriarty from the depths of his patient's unconscious. Having identified the existence of Dr. Green, Hammond had devised a foolproof method of identifying the handiwork of his nemesis in the minds of his patients.
If there were a doctor associated with this programming, and his name were a color, like Dr. Chartreuse or something, if his name were a color, what would the color be?
Hammond had claimed that Dr. Green had programmed the minds of his patients as one might a computer, ready to be rebooted or overwritten or probed with the right structured queries. He went on to describe a detailed system of how multiple personalities were created in circuit-like networks, activated by entering the corresponding verbal codes.
How many of you have come on to computer things in patients? Sometimes they'll have numbers instead, sometimes they'll be called systems information directors. I would say I want the central inner core of you to take control of the finger signals. The core is a cult-created part. Now I want to ask that inner core of you, is there any part of you who knows anything about alpha, beta, delta, or theta? And omega has to do with self-destruct programming. Alpha and omega, the beginning and the end.
He hypnotized me and put me in trance, and then he asked me about the Greek alphabet and asked me to name any of the Greek letters of the alphabet that I knew, and I named a few. And then he asked me for the gamma erasure code, and I didn't know what he was talking about. They told me that I had already been programmed that if I divulged the secrets from the cult, that I would self-destruct.
But more than just cracking the psychiatric source code of Green's mind control algorithm, Hammond had also divined the heinous plot of the Satan-worshipping Nazi mind doctors.
People say, what's the purpose of it? My best guess is that the purpose of it is that they want an army of Manchurian candidates. And eventually, the megalomaniacs at the top believe, create a satanic order that will rule the world. Have any of you ever heard of the Illuminati with regard to the cult? It appears to be the name of the international world leadership. There appear to be Illuminati councils in several parts of the world, and one internationally. But remember the Process Church? Roman Polanski's wife, Sharon Tate, was killed by the Manson family who were associated with the Process Church. And a lot of prominent people in Hollywood were associated. Then they went underground, the books say, in about 78 and vanished.
Like frontline therapists, for whom nothing a patient could say would qualify as disconfirming evidence, Hammond likened critics of his theory to Holocaust deniers. In his mind, the only other explanation was that they, too, were in some way involved with this malevolent enterprise. He used the same logic to dismiss complaints about the total lack of evidence for any of this. Agents of Dr. Green must be working in mortuaries across the country, he reasoned, signing fraudulent death certificates to cover up the crimes, to ensure not a shred of physical evidence could ever be found.
For a long time, I would tell a select group of therapists that I knew and trusted information and say, spread it out, don't spread my name, don't say where it came from, but here's some information. Share it with other therapists if you find us on target, and I'd appreciate your feedback.
How many therapists have you told about all this? How many therapists have you been training?
I suppose there have been over 1,000 therapists that I've said something to.
Hammond admitted he'd been spreading the myths of Dr. Green and his satanic Illuminati Nazi brainwashing program for years into a bureaucratic mechanism that captured, drugged and brainwashed individuals, mostly women and children, into believing they had witnessed and partaken in some of the most horrific acts imaginable. Across the United States, this convergence of ideological possession, greed, gullibility and professional malpractice constituted an immense machine to manufacture testimonies and recirculate them through videotapes, training courses and talk shows, through psychiatric and police conferences, through word of mouth. While there were frauds and swindlers enriching themselves in this endeavour, most of the psychiatrists and police officers, social workers, journalists and activists that validated these stories and spread these myths worked in the belief that they were reducing harm inflicted on the most vulnerable people in society. Intoxicated by the belief that they were acting to save people from underground networks working in the shadows to destroy lives, they became unable to see that they were becoming one themselves.
I mean, a fantasy is something that happens in your head. It doesn't go past your head. Once you have somebody acting out whatever that scenario might be in your head, it is an act in the world. It is real. It is real behavior with real consequences to real people. And so it has been a very brilliant part of the pornographer's propaganda campaign to protect pornography, to characterize the industry as an industry of fantasy.
In 1992, the same year that Corey Hammond made his Green Bomb speech at the Radisson Plaza Hotel in Virginia, FBI Special Agent Kenneth Lanning of the Bureau's Behavioural Science Unit released a comprehensive report on satanic ritual abuse. Lanning had been investigating ritual abuse cases for almost a decade, and at the start treated them like any other form of bizarre or deviant behaviour that he encountered on his job. But 5 years in, after pursuing more and more similar cases, doubts began to form. How could such a widespread criminal network of torture, murder and cannibalism leave behind no physical evidence whatsoever? Like Alonso de Salazar in centuries past, he sought out hard facts, not just testimonies, for the more than 400 satanic cells that had been reported across the country. He began to voice his skepticism at conferences in the late 80s, but in such a highly charged environment, it was met by accusations by some colleagues that he may be part of the conspiracy himself. His core point, though, was that the energy, attention and resources being thrown at chasing these phantom networks was distracting from real cases of child abuse. He wrote of the sloppiness of the terminology for the crimes. A satanic murder should be defined as one committed by two or more individuals who rationally plan the crime and whose primary motivation is to fulfill a prescribed satanic ritual calling for the murder. And by this definition, I've been unable to identify even one satanic murder in the United States. His report chastised the Bureau's lack of professionalism and gullibility in validating the bizarre cases pursued by local law enforcement.
Are human beings being sacrificed? Yes.
People don't want to believe the unbelievable.
Throughout the 90s, this skepticism began to gain momentum as people finally started to speak out about what was happening. A series of influential books were released exposing the scandal at the heart of the psychiatric community and the authorities' credulous acceptance of these astonishing claims. And TV specials, including January 1993's Primetime Live and October 1995's Frontline, exposed the fraud to a large television audience.
Satanic ritual abuse has become the fastest growing and most controversial psychological phenomenon in the country. Insurance claims for psychiatric treatment linked to the diagnosis have jumped as much as 50% in just the last year.
The therapist that I was dealing with was pretty much like a guru to me. I literally got to the point where I would have believed just about anything she put into my mind. I was on a lot of medication, and whenever I would question the therapist about my doubts, she would increase the medication, put me into hypnosis.
He put Mary on a variety of medications, among them Halcyon, Klonopin, Xanax, Prozac, and on experimentally high doses of the heart medication Inderol.
From the time I entered the hospital until we got the children out of the hospital by court order, it was 1,200 days.
And how much money?
So we're looking at $3 million.
Their bill for medication alone was in the tens of thousands of dollars. Hospital room and board was well over $1 million.
The focus was generally on patients with very rich benefits plans, and I would find in some cases that large numbers of people from single employers with those types of plans would suddenly be presenting with this diagnosis. An incidence of multiple personality way beyond anything reasonable that could be expected for a given population of individuals. So
it stopped because I stopped following Dr. Braun's orders. I stopped taking the medication, and I stopped being involved in the hypnosis. And when my head started to clear after detoxing off of all of that medicine, and my critical thinking skills started to return, the switching stopped. All these goofy things that were going on weren't happening anymore. And I was able to finally take a look at this and say, you know, wait a minute, where are all these bodies? Where are all these people that are supposed to be involved in this cult?
These four women are all former patients of Dallas psychotherapist Michael Moore.
He made you believe that all these pictures going on in your head
was reality, was real stuff.
Even more troubling, many patients who claim to be victims of satanic ritual abuse have suffered some serious childhood trauma, making them especially vulnerable now to hypnosis and fantasy.
By the time the McMartin daycare trial had collapsed in 1990, it had become the longest and most expensive criminal trial in US legal history.
The trial has become a marathon. It's cost so far over $15 million. The evidence of abuse was largely developed by social worker Key McFarland, who used puppets to get the children who were between the ages of 2 and 6 to reveal what had happened.
After the testimonies of the children were shown to be unreliable, the scant physical evidence was likewise revealed to be illusory. A demonic black robe discovered at the house of the accused was revealed to be a graduation dress, and what was thought to be evidence of secret tunnels from beneath the school, excavated privately in an archaeological dig part funded by Gloria Steinem, was revealed to be trash pits dating from the 1920s. Even after vindication, a television poll showed that 87% of the respondents thought the defendants were guilty.
And I think, if anything, the Martin case was an extension of and dramatized the way we in the media, and especially television because of its emphasis on pictures, cover a lot of stories, especially crime stories.
I must state for the record, however, that the charges against most of the defendants have been dropped.
But 7 of the 12 jurors said they believed the children had been abused.
The episode exposed journalists' credulity and lack of fact-checking as a serious problem in validating and perpetuating these myths.
I mean, a lot of it has to do with just the way we sort of cavalierly, I think, smear reputations and play loosely with reputations.
Judas Priest and CBS Records are not liable in causing the deaths of James Vance and Raymond Belknap. There is no proof of backwards masking on the album, and in any case, no scientific proof that backwards masking can be perceived or affect conduct.
The Lanning report concluded that in the public debate between emotion and reason, emotion almost always wins. Regardless of intelligence and education, and in spite of common sense or evidence to the contrary, adults tend to believe what they want or need to believe. As the Berlin Wall fell, the threat of global Armageddon began to fade from our imagination. As the debilitating haze of these anxieties ceased to cloud our judgment, so too did stories of sinister demonic forces fade from the public eye as authority figures no longer lent their credibility to the elemental forces of unreason. But although the fever had lifted, this new age of mass media persisted, and the nature of our collective attention remained forever transformed.
Why did you name yourself Death?
Because it is something that she fears greatly.
Everyone's so afraid of death, I think, that they want to get closer to it by fascinating over things like serial killers and horror movies and car crashes. I found that Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson were the two most memorable people from the 60s. I thought it was interesting that things like talk shows put them on the same kind of celebrity status.
In other words, like, I got all this fucking attention on me. I got 900 million people. You dig what I'm saying? Now, how do I get away from them?
When you trigger these vast media that we use, you are manipulating entire populations.
The 20th century saw some of the most awesome and horrifying events in all of human history. We saw the unfolding of this strange new epoch, not with our own eyes, but through a world-spanning electronic nervous system, something entirely new in the history of our species. A deluge of image and sound, containing every story ever told, and all that are to come. In this roaring flux of emotion and information, of mythic archetype and legend, we try to make sense of the turbulence that surrounds us. In the great confusion, we see the flickering terrors of collective imagination as we try and make sense of what lies before us.
One scientist put the urgency of the greenhouse potential in biblical terms.
Waking to anxieties of geological scale and wrestling with natures both animal and divine, the demons we fear the most are those within ourselves.
Hundreds of millions of people
will worship that inanimate object.
ARPA was formed by President Eisenhower after Sputnik. Its mission, to guard the U.S. against technological surprise.
Never before has there been a computer so powerful and yet so easy to use at such an affordable price.
Pioneering work on networking technologies resulted in the birth of the Internet.
Instead of going through information that's on your personal computer, it's as if there's a million computers on the Internet inside your own personal computer.
It's a sociological phenomenon which is redefining the word community.
The time and space constraints of our normal communities are not there.
The power of the Internet is demonstrated as we travel back in time.
The beauty of the World Wide Web is its ability to link you with similar topics or ideas elsewhere on the web.
Now we have an opportunity for citizens to create their own communications with each other.
We can go here and download entire copies of books.
The self-publishing nature of the net means that anyone can have a home page.
We have a website now. You know, it's the popular thing. Everybody has to have a website. We have a website on the Internet called Heaven's Gate. HeavensGate, of course, .com.
The Heaven's Gate Code brought together some of the more ancient beliefs with the newest technology.
In addition to its own website, the group constructed web pages for businesses. But few of those clients knew about the bizarre motivation behind Heaven's Gate. The largest mass suicide in U.S. history was indeed a well-planned event. The dead were all found lying on cots and bunk beds. The group also left behind a videotape, an attempt to explain the question they knew the world would ask.
Forces of Lucifer, of Satan, the lower forces of this planet, that run this planet, by the way, through morality, through responsibility as human, to brainwash humans to expect heaven on earth, to work toward the future. This is year 2000. This is the millennium. This is the beginning of the end. That's why we're talking.
So you can talk to people who have similar problems that you might not otherwise be able to meet or get to have this conversation with, right?
Yes, in fact, you can have a kind of ready-made community when you need one.
Let's go to the full search screen and enter Civil War.
Ordinary people are becoming electronic publishers. They're putting up the things that mean something to them and they want to share it with the rest of the world.
And for me, this is a tremendous opportunity for people to express themselves and be heard throughout the world.
Has anyone ever said you live in a fantasy world? People create their own on the internet all the time.
How to make money on the internet? Well, lots of businesses, large and small, are trying to figure out how to do just that.
I think we're going to be able to bring these products to not just hundreds of thousands or a few million people, but tens of millions of people.
How you can make big money from your opinion, tonight at 6.
I'd like to add a word about safety, though. You have to remember the internet is not a regulated environment, so the quality and accuracy of various informational offerings can differ quite a bit.
This non-linear digital approach to journalism raises both ethical and procedural questions that Malamud looks forward to discussing on the internet.
The story of the internet is still unfolding.
Predicting what's to come is hard, but when we think about the future, I think it's probably worth looking at the present for clues.
There's a lot of confusion between Satanism and witchcraft. The two terms are usually lumped together as one.
Is it possible for things to happen to you that you've forgotten and you're beginning to remember?
Sarah, another priestess, and myself used to have to do lesbian-type dances in front of Mark.
They were telling me things that you only saw in horror films and read in fictitious books.
Up to 6 babies as a young woman, which were aborted and used for sacrifice in a variety of ways in covens.
Some children claim that they have seen babies microwaved, and they have said it then fizzled and whatever.
And then a lot of Latin guff was talked.
Do you remember that girl up north we met?
That's right. Yeah, she was absolutely ensnared by it. You know, she just had a simple seance in her house because she thought it was just some fun, you know, something fun to do. And the television exploded, things started flying around the room.
One of the other priestesses was a nun, was dressed up as a nun. She had to wee into a bucket